April 3, 1952. An exercise in thinking about the pendulum. Through the action of the law of the pendulum, the violence that a man does to others returns on himself. History abundantly illustrates this. The saying, therefore, that we should do unto others as we would that they should do unto us is connected with one aspect of freeing oneself from this law to which mechanical man is subject. One-sided behavior, characteristic of mechanical man, puts him under the law of the pendulum. It will excite the opposite in the sense of what I do will be done to me. This must be the meaning of the saying that those who live by the sword shall perish by the sword. Now we are not to limit the action of the law of the pendulum to a single life. Mr. O told some of us that, when asked about recurrence, G had replied, it is something like this. The executed becomes the executioner. The executioner becomes the executed. In short, the situation is reversed. Passive becomes active and active becomes passive. The situation is turned the other way round. Now mentally it is possible to turn things the other way round, only most people obstinately refuse to do so. In this respect we are taught, as an exercise to increase consciousness, to try sometimes to take consciously the opposite view to the one we mechanically take. This is including the opposite, but not rejecting the other viewpoint. It is bringing the opposites together towards a middle, by including both sides in consciousness. It is not a conversion into the contrary, but a recognition of it. It is a very useful exercise if from time to time one really does it. It widens the range of the mind. As an exercise it is related to the practice of external considering. Among many other blessings, to be increasingly conscious of both sides of the pendulum decreases violence. For example, one can be plagued by a sudden attack of violent thinking and feeling. When this occurs one is obviously identified with an extreme position of the pendulum. What, then, is the opposite that one must summon into the consciousness to balance matters if one wishes to work on this unpleasant state? To call up the conventional opposite, that is, to picture oneself filled with gentleness and tolerance, as one remembers one was, say, yesterday, is not likely to prove the effective opposite that will give release. The effort may simply aggravate the state. Where is the effective opposite to be found? The answer is that it will be found in what you do not include in your feeling of yourself. In a recent paper on the pendulum, it was remarked that the opposite is often curious and not at all what one would suppose. For according to the common use of words one would expect a violent man to be in some sense the opposite of a man who is gentle. In the above example, taking myself as the victim of a sudden attack of violence, I find gentleness is not the effective opposite. If it were, it should neutralize the violence through my word memory of gentle states in myself, that is, through my consciously remembering gentler states that I have observed and connected with the memory of observing but I am supposing that this has had no result and that I realize I am in danger of descending into some really negative state or other from which I have learned to pray to be delivered. Now, my effort to save myself by making myself conscious in the opposite could not have any result, because in this case, the opposite is not gentleness, but something that I am not conscious of and so do not include in my estimation of myself. Therefore it is only when I behold in myself what has roused my violence in another person that the storm vanishes as by magic. The opposites here are between what I am conscious of in another and what I am conscious of in myself. If these two factors in two people were equal, they would cancel each other out, and the two people would be at peace with one another. But each would have to include far more in their own consciousness of themselves to reach this degree of conscious relationship to one another. The opposites that I am dealing with here are there, for the great ones of light and darkness. For what I am conscious of is in the light, and what I am unconscious of is in the darkness, and these two are mighty powers at variance with one another. Throughout ancient history you find myths about this struggle between light and darkness, of the hero of light contending with the dragon of darkness, or being temporarily swallowed by the monster and cutting his way out, and so on. The work teaches that we are not properly conscious. It indicates that the supreme aim is to increase consciousness. As we are, we belong to the people who live in darkness and shun the light. We will not face ourselves. We refuse to see. We change the subject or justify ourselves. Now what lies in your own darkness has a strange power over you. It keeps on influencing you, and however you seem to resist, it overpowers you. At intervals its secret will paralyzes the conscious will. Only the hero, consciousness, can contend with its dragon power. The hero lives, to begin with, in that camera by which we can observe ourselves and thereby begin to widen and so increase our consciousness of ourselves. One is actually taught that to observe oneself is to let a ray of light into one's inner darkness, that is, into what one is unconscious of and so what one does not include in the customary feeling of oneself. Oh. This accursed artificial thing oneself, this oversensitive bundle, this silly exert that causes so much trouble and which possesses us without our seeing it. Now the more one's consciousness widens, the more it includes, and the fewer will be the opposites, and so the less will one's spiritual existence be at the mercy of swinging pendulums. This oneself is notably exclusive. It is extraordinarily exclusive. It will not include the other side of the penny in consciousness. Certainly, one should hate this oneself, which is a lie. The self-love runs into it. But the self-love should have a far better goal, for this oneself, that gives rise to so many unnecessary opposites in us by its stubborn refusal to include anything more than it does in the consciousness, is not the self that we ultimately come into when consciousness is widened sufficiently and the boundaries of the silly little oneself are swept away. In conclusion, I will try to make this exercise in thinking easier and will put the matter a little differently. The antithesis really seems to be between, he is a fool - I am not a fool. I fabricate this pair of opposites so that the more I conceive myself as not being a fool, the more my violence is kept going against him for being so great a fool. Now the root of the matter is my feeling of superiority. To try to bring up gentleness or a vision of non-violence will not therefore neutralize my attack of violence. If I become conscious that the fool I behold in him is also in me, the antithesis becomes, he is a fool - I am also a fool. These are not opposites, so that the antithesis vanishes.